Welcome life science learners to another installment. Today we're looking at reproduction in vertebrates. As we get into the topic, it's important that we understand that reproduction is a basic characteristic of all living organisms. The ability to be able to reproduce is important for every species so that they can sustain their population. It's important that we understand the difference between what vertebrates are and invertebrates. Today our focus is on just how reproduction occurs in vertebrates. What are vertebrates? Remember that when we refer to vertebrates, we refer to organisms or individuals that have a skeleton which has a skull along with a spinal column. So clearly our focus today is on looking at how your vertebrates reproduce. Let's get into the concepts of the lesson and then we'll unpack the details of reproduction in vertebrates. Well, in our lesson today, we're going to focus on what are the reproductive strategies that are necessary for organisms to reproduce successfully. We are going to look at different reproductive strategies and we're going to unpack some concepts around how fertilization occurs, etc. Let's get into that in a little while. So it's important that we understand the diversity of reproductive strategies. Now, what is it that we mean by when we refer to reproductive strategies? Now, it's important that we recognize that reproduction, as I said, is a fundamental aspect of all living organisms. The ability to be able to reproduce ensures that the species survives. And many different species have different strategies that allow them to reproduce successfully. Essentially, it's important for us to recognize that not every species reproduces in a similar way, meaning that there are different methods of reproduction that increases their chances of the young surviving, growing up and producing more offspring. So let's unpack these reproductive strategies. So as I mentioned, reproduction is a characteristic of all organisms, and this ensures that they continue the existence of their species. It is essential to be able to reproduce successfully. Animals use a variety of different reproductive strategies to increase their reproductive success in different environments. Reproductive strategies are structural, functional, and behavior adaptations that increase the chances of fertilization and the survival of the offspring. The success of reproductive strategies depends on how a species utilizes energy to produce and to care for their offspring. So it's important that we understand that reproduction has several levels to it. The amount of energy spent on the physical process is one aspect that we consider. Another aspect is the amount of energy that is spent on raising the young. So let's consider all of those factors when we consider the fact that reproduction is a complex living process. It's important that we understand that there are two types of reproductive strategies, broadly speaking. These are referred to as the R strategy and the K strategy. What is it that these strategies talk to? Essentially, these are different strategies that essentially play out or display the chances of individuals surviving from the time they are born till the time they reach adulthood. And so we know that some species have a high survival rate, others have a low survival rate. So how is it possible that a species of organisms where their reproductive strategies are not as advanced as a developed species still is able to survive and produce offsprings? Let's look at that by unpacking these two strategies. So we refer to one strategy as the R strategy and the other as the K strategy. In this graph, what I've illustrated is a graph indicating the percentage of maximum lifespan. So this is time of birth, and this is possibly a percentage of their maximum lifespan. And on the y-axis, we essentially have a chance or percentage chance of them surviving from birth. So here we know that when individuals are born or hatched, they have a high percentage chance of survival once they come onto existence. However, that varies through time. And so this graph shows you two distinct strategies, the K strategy or the K selection and the R selection or the R strategy. And what happens if we look at the K strategy, we see that from the time of birth, the chances of survival are extremely high, and that gradually decreases as the organism reaches its maximum lifespan. So we say that here is a very successful strategy that ensures that many of the offspring survive the initial phase of birth. They reach their maximum lifespan where they probably now age and die. However, if we look at the blue line, which indicates the R selection or the R strategy, it shows that from the time of birth, there is a rapid or there's a drastic decrease in their chances of survival, with a few surviving and actually reaching their maximum life expectancy. The graph that's indicated type 2 in the middle shows you a proportionate decrease in their chances of survival from the time of birth. Let's look at examples of these in a while. So an R strategy specialist or selection in species, they spend much of their energy on producing many offsprings, but they spend little time or energy on caring for the offspring. So if we look at this graph, we can see that there's a lot of the number of young that are produced are exponentially high. There's very little parental care, and hence there's a drastic decrease in the survival of the young. Most of the offspring die before adulthood, and we notice that most of them die before even reaching 50% of their lifespan, but sufficient numbers survive to continue their species. And this essentially ensures that the species survives. So to compensate for a lack of parental care, they produce large number of offspring. And so the idea is that some of them will survive and ensure that the species can continue. When we look at the K strategy, we can look at some animals that produce fewer offsprings. They have expended large amounts of energy on parental care. It means that the offsprings have a better chance of surviving to become adults. And we see that amongst many mammals and us as humans. So when we're born, there's a lot of parental care that is offered in terms of nurturing and developing most mammals. And so they produce fewer offspring. And that successful parental care ensures that the species survives. In this illustration, we're looking at a comparison between the R strategy on the one extreme and the K strategy on the other extreme. And if we look at these, we can see here we have oysters that are being compared to some of our larger primates. What we notice is that oysters spend a lot of energy on producing millions of eggs. And these eggs are around, 500 million a year that are produced. However, it's important that we recognize that there is no parental care, and very few of them survive. If we compare that to the other end of the spectrum, you'll find that some of our larger cats and larger primates produce 2 offsprings a year, or in terms of humans or larger mammals, sometimes even 1 or 2 offsprings every 5 years. There's a degree of parental care that involves in raising the young, and that means that in order for the species to survive, they rather care for the young and provide large amounts of energy and care for them. As we wrap this section up, it's important that we compare the R and K strategies as reproductive strategy mechanisms. Firstly, let's look at the offsprings per brood in terms of the number that are produced. In an R strategy, we have many offsprings that are produced, whereas in the K strategy, we have fewer. And this has got to do with the level or the degree of parental care. Because there are many offsprings produced, the parents do not have the energy to care, so the energy for parental care is much less. If we compare that to the K strategy individuals show larger amounts of parental care, and this ensures greater success in survival of the young. The mortality refers to the death rate in the R strategy is high, and that's because of a lack of parental care. If we compare that to mammals and other organisms that show high amounts of parental care, there are few individuals that are born that actually die, and that's got linked to the parental care in nurturing, in feeding the young. We also notice that the R strategy species generally have smaller offsprings. Their body size is much smaller. If we compare that to your K strategies, they have larger body sizes and they're capable of surviving independently. If we look at the onset of maturity, in our strategy species, they generally have an early age at which they mature. However, K strategy individuals tend to mature much later, and that's linked to their proper development until they reach sexual maturity. Reproduction is often once in their lifetime. When we compare that to K strategies, they produce multiple times in their lifespan. And that's because the process of reproduction in our strategies requires a lot of energy. And so often this happens only once in their lifetime. Generally, your R strategy species live in very unstable environments, whereas your K strategies tend to occupy stable environments, and that's important in their greater survival chance. The type of species that these are generally ones that are the pioneer species, right at the bottom of the trophic level. If we compare them to the K strategies, these are generally your secondary, tertiary, and much more climax species that have established in an environment. The population sizes may vary, and that's what is unique about an R strategy. There may be times in the year that their populations rapidly change because of effects in the environment. However, the K strategy populations tend to remain stable throughout their existence. So guys, that's a wrap for this section. We've spent some time looking at a comparison between the K strategy and the R strategy. Let's have a short break, freshen up, relax a bit, and then we'll continue with the rest of this lesson. See you in a bit.